The King James translators improperly capitalized the Hebrew adjective aviv, removed the direct object the, and made it the name of a month, Abib. Yet they never capitalized the proper nouns, Sabbath, Passover, or any of the feast of the Lord. The accuracy with which God's laws maintain the celestial time clock has only been recently appreciated. In the decades that followed astronauts putting mirrors on the moon, both NASA and amateur astronomers have reflected laser beams off these mirrors to precisely calculate the lunation period. The lunar cycle, by which all of the feasts of the Lord have been kept since Mount Sinai, can now be reverse calculated with precision. The chronological Gospels could not have been done without these reverse calculations. We can now accurately pinpoint every Sabbath and feast day in Yeshua's ministry. We know the day he healed the blind on the Sabbath that began Hanukkah. We know the day of his crucifixion and his resurrection 3 days and 3 nights later. We now know the signs in the heavens that the Chaldean astronomers recognized as the sign of the birth of the King of Israel.
And you brought me Matthew 15, which is, it's just so clear when I read it. Can we look at Matthew 15?
Well, first of all, let's set the stage on this, because this is the 20th day of the 6th month. It is Thursday, and we're heading toward the Capernaum synagogue in 2 days, where he's going to be teaching on the last day and the resurrection, which is detailed in John chapter 6.
Can I, for those who have never heard you teach on this before, Michael, are you telling us that you know that this particular incident took place on a Thursday, and this is in your chronological Gospels?
Right.
Wow. Okay.
Exactly, because
you've nailed this down to specific days of the week.
We know exactly when it transpires, because we know what transpires on his way to the Sabbath, what he's teaching on the Sabbath in the synagogue, and at that night, at the end of the Sabbath, after teaching on the last day in the resurrection, that's when the new moon was sighted that night, and so the first day of the week is now Yom Teruah, the day of trumpets. And so he's in the synagogue the next day with all these people.
So
this is what transpires. He feeds 5,000 people, men, plus women and children, with leavened bread on this particular situation.
And there was some fish in there too, right?
There's fish, but it's leavened bread. And then what happens on Yom Teruah, the Pharisees end up showing up, and this is what we read in Matthew 15, verse 1. Then came to Jesus, Yeshua, scribes and Pharisees, which were from Jerusalem, and they said to him, why do your disciples, which again, we're talking thousands and thousands that have been following him, okay? We're not talking the 12 sent ones, apostles. We're talking about all these disciples. Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders, for they wash not their hands when they eat bread?
And I hear that, I'm like, what are you talking about? Where in the Torah of Moses does it say to wash your hands before you eat bread? That is specifically identified in the oral law as what are called takanot, which are takanot are these reforms that change biblical law, and there's a very clear distinction. I grew up with this distinction. There's mitzvot deoraita, commandments of the Torah, and mitzvot derabanan, commandments of our rabbis. Now, commandments of the Torah in rabbinical speak doesn't necessarily mean it comes from the Torah. It means the rabbis read that from the Torah, whereas the commandments of the rabbis have no basis in the Torah. They're simply things where the rabbis enact a new law. They make these new takanot, these new enactments, and you are bound by those in some ways more than you're bound by the Torah itself. For example, there's a passage in the Tractate of Eruvin in the Talmud that says if you violate a commandment of the Torah, the punishment is lashes. If you violate the takanot of the rabbis, the punishment is death. So in some ways it's more severe and more intense your required observance of these man-made laws of the rabbis.
This is immediately what came to mind in Galatians 2, chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. Paul, Shaul, is speaking of this incident in which he is at Antioch. Peter's there with them. They're eating, they're drinking. Everything is going great with the Gentiles. They're having just a great time. But then certain came from James. Now, we read about this in Acts 15, that there were Pharisees who become believers in Yeshua, but they're carrying all the baggage of their Phariseeism with them. And so now they show up in Antioch, and Peter now no longer is going to eat with the Gentiles. He was fine before the Torah police show up. Now these guys come in, and so I want you to take from there, because Nehemiah, we all know that you are an incredible Hebrew scholar, but you read the Greek fluently, and as far as understanding Shaul, Paul, as a Pharisee and where he's coming from, you understand him like very few people on the planet understand them. I see Paul tortured all the time, even in the Hebrew roots moment, because they don't know the Torah from where he's quoting. You know what the rules and regulations are. Take us into that incident in Galatians.
I mean, it's true. A lot of people I encountered in the Hebrew roots movement think Paul was the first Calvinist, and they try to force him into that mold.
Yeah.
And look, like me, Paul was raised as a Pharisee, and he even said after his conversion that he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. I'm not a Pharisee of the Pharisees. I'm a Karaite Jew now. But you know, so here's his verse, Galatians 2:12. It says, "For before certain men came from James, he, meaning Peter, would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy." Barnabas, who isn't even Jewish, is playing this game. So why is Paul condemning Peter for this? What's the hypocrisy, right? And I think most people read this and they say, oh, well, I mean, it's clear they were having ham. And he was eating ham until James's people showed up, and he stopped eating the ham. Okay, does that make sense that Peter was eating ham? It's possible, but that's not the way I read it. I think it's more likely. See, here you have to understand the Pharisee context. So what is the most basic meaning of what it meant to be a Pharisee in the first century before the destruction of the temple? And the most basic concept was to separate yourself from uncleanness. This word prushi, Pharisee, comes from the word parash. Parash means to literally, the most common usage and the literal usage is you would have a lump of dough, and they would pull off a piece of that dough and give it to the priest. And once that piece was removed, that piece of dough was holy, and that was to Pharisee the dough. And that's called lahafrish challah. Challah, which you have on Shabbat, literally in that context refers to the piece of dough, not the whole loaf, but actually the piece of dough taken off. So they're Phariseeing the challah. They're taking off the piece and giving it to the priest. And from then forth, you can't eat that little piece of dough. That is holy and belongs to the priests. So the Pharisees come along and they say, we're going to Pharisee ourselves, not the dough, ourselves to God by not eating meat unless we're in a state of ritual purity. Now, the Torah only requires us to be in a state of ritual purity to eat sacrificial meat. Deuteronomy 12 comes along and says, no, if you're eating non-sacrificial meat, the clean and the unclean may eat of it, like the deer and the gazelle. And why does it say deer and gazelle? Because deer and gazelle can't be brought as sacrifices. So always the clean and the unclean can eat the deer and the gazelle. And if you're eating a cow or a goat or a sheep, if it's a non-sacrifice, it doesn't matter whether you're clean or unclean, you may eat of it. The animal has to be clean, but the man doesn't have to be clean. The woman doesn't have to be clean. So the Pharisees come along and say, no, all of our meat will eat in a state of ritual purity, and we'll separate ourselves from the people, the masses, and the Gentiles who don't follow these rules. So there is Peter, and he's sitting with these Gentiles, and they're eating perfectly biblical, clean food, but the Gentiles touch the food, making it unclean, according to the Pharisee understanding. He has no problem with that until the Frum police show up and they shomer shame him like they did to poor Ivanka Trump. And they say, Peter, what are you doing? Our rabbis have taught that we're supposed to be holier, not just from the Gentiles and from the Jewish masses. We have to be Pharisee from the masses. And so then he gets embarrassed and say, well, what will the creatures say? Ma yomru habriot is the Jewish expression. What will the creatures say? And he says, okay, I can't do this. I'm going to have to pretend. I have to follow these Pharisee rules, even though I know they're not God's rules. And the really cool thing, as we were discussing this before, Michael, is I pulled up, I do what my friend Keith calls tap, tap. And I pull up on my computer program here and I say, well, it says in Galatians 2:12 that Peter withdrew and separated himself. I have a sneaking suspicion that that word has something, that's an important word. And I look it up in Greek, and the word is aphorizo, or in this form of it, aphorizane. And that actually sounds like the word Pharisee. And this is something ancient translators often did. If there was several different ways to translate a word in the target language, they looked for a word that sounded like the original word. And it's very clear to me that the original word here is that he withdrew and he Phariseed himself. And so they translate it that way in Greek, aphorizo, he Phariseed himself. And then you have in the Aramaic and the Pshita, parash, the same exact word, he Phariseed himself. And then I did the next thing, I looked how is this word used throughout the New Testament in the Greek. And the really cool thing is it's used in this Jewish sense of to separate yourself for holiness. And which is fine when it's the proper way to do it. So Romans 1:1, for example, it talks about Paul, a bondservant. It says, called to be an apostle, Pharisee to the gospel of God. So he's separated to the gospel of God, aphorizo, same word in Greek, and probably the Hebrew background behind that is the same word. There's no negative connotation there, clearly, right? The negative connotation that Paul is talking about is in Galatians is because he's separating himself, he's Phariseeing himself people in a matter where there's no prohibition. God didn't command you not to eat food touched by. That was the whole dream that Peter had. Don't call those men unclean, which is what the Pharisees have done, and therefore don't eat meat that they've touched. That was his dream that he had. And that's fine in his house, but when people are looking, all of a sudden he separates himself. And one last thing, 2 Corinthians 6:17, Paul is speaking here. He says, come out from among them and be separated, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. If you look at the context there of what he means about unclean, he's talking about food sacrificed to idols. So food sacrificed to idols, that you shouldn't be eating, that you shouldn't be consuming. But food that was just touched by Gentiles, there's no prohibition. That's a man-made rule and regulation. That's something the Pharisees invented. And when you do that, when you Pharisee yourself according to man's rules and not God's rules, then you're a hypocrite. That's what Paul's teaching.
This is absolutely incredible. And of course, this all puts to light, taking us right back to Acts 15, that there were Pharisees who become followers of Yeshua, but they bring all of their baggage with them, all the rules and regulations with them, because, you could probably speak to this, since we've got like 30 seconds left, that when you're raised as a Pharisee, you don't know the difference between the written Torah and the oral Torah.
Oh, it's deeply ingrained. It's very difficult to it took me years to distinguish what does God say and what does the rabbi say he says. And it really takes years of deep programming to get back, to peel away the layers and get back to the Word of God.